Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and for their stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. But then he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation." After you've been here a while, you can begin to tell the difference. No matter what it is, the sound always starts out slow and low. A quiet whine that turns into a rumble, an echo that starts just beyond the horizon and grows louder as it makes its approach. And as the sound gets nearer, as the windows start to shake, as the walls around you start to tell you that something is coming, that's when you realize you've been here long enough to tell the difference. Because the aggressive chop, chop, chop of the air ripped apart by helicopter blades sounds different from the banshee screams of an F-22 flying a little too fast and a little too low for comfort, which sounds different from the private twin prop plane whose new pilot is practicing touch and goes, which sounds different from the incessant, never-ending, every 5-minute interruptions of the commercial 737s that make their presence known with their chemtrails etched across the sky. When you've been here long enough, you begin to be able to tell the difference. Because as hard as you try, there are some things that are just too loud to block out. The gospel tells us that later, after his persecution, his prosecution, his death, and his resurrection, Jesus appeared to the 11, just as they were sitting at the table. And the story tells us that there at that table, he scolded them. Shut away from the safe and in their comforting room, he scolded them. He scolded them for their lack of faith, for their stubbornness. He scolded them because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. As a worship leader and a preacher at a church that is less than a mile from the end of a runway at a large and active airport, it is my prerogative to say, airplanes are a preacher's nightmare. It is inevitable that in the quiet moments at the end of a song or a prayerful pause for reflection, that there will be a rude interruption by the growing groans of a plane hidden behind the beauty of the stained glass windows. That a baptism, rather than being blessed by the sprinkling of water, will be drowned out by incessant noise. That weddings and funerals, often the happiest and saddest days of people's lives, will be marked by the reminder that no matter what goes on in this space, life outside these walls never stops. Yes, for a preacher in the flight path, planes are a preaching nightmare. A supersonic scolding that can often stand in the way of worship, of ritual, of the Spirit, in all the ways she makes herself known. Yes, as a preacher in a flight path, planes can be a real pain. But as a preacher who wants to preach in the way Jesus calls me to, sharing the good news with all the world, I believe the sound of these airplanes is also a powerful gift. Because with every plane that passes, there's an unavoidable reminder that to acknowledge what's going on outside, that there's a call to preach the gospel louder, to ensure that it can be heard, to make every quiet moment meaningful, and every loud moment amplified. The airplanes remind me that as much as I might want to soundproof my sanctuary or reinforce my walls, my role as a preacher is not to sit around in an echo chamber and wait for the good news as I perceive it to come, but instead to honor the arrivals and departures and bless fully and authentically the precious and sacred time that's in between. Our scripture began with Jesus giving a scolding. Our scripture ends with Jesus giving a call. Go into all the world, he says, and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. We are all preachers. And while we may not all live on a flight path, each and every one of us will need to contend with the noise outside. But we must remember that while the outside noise might be loud, the gospel is always louder. Louder than the helicopter, louder than the prop plane, louder than the fighter jet, louder than the 737, louder even than the cacophony of our lives. We must remember that as preachers, we just need to find the right timing to proclaim it. And when we do, the good news will always soar.